Welcome to the Think Institute podcast with Joel Settecase. I'm Joel Settecase, and this is the show that tackles impossible questions from a biblical perspective to help you explain, share, and defend the Christian message. Now, before we get started, I have to tell you about my amazing headgear here. It was inspired by today's guest. And today's guest is truly remarkable. More on him in just a moment, but you're going to see that once I bring him on here, if you're watching live, if you're listening by audio later on, you're going to be truly missing out, because as well as I pull off this hat, our guest pulls it off far, far better. And full disclosure, he had his on first, even though you're seeing mine first. So I was inspired by him. But this is the show that tackles impossible questions from a biblical perspective. And my name is Joel Settecase. If you don't know me, I am a theologian. That means that I help explain what God is like and help people understand him and know him better. And a quick housekeeping item: the Hammer and Anvil Society is launching its brand new cohorts starting in January. The Hammer and Anvil Society is the sinister saintly society of the Think Institute, and the mission is to help you understand, explain, and defend the Christian message, and to make a decisive impact for Christ's kingdom in your community. Now, these cohorts are small groups of people that meet together, and they meet together to study, discuss, and live out biblical teaching. They are led and taught by yours truly and facilitated by you. If you want to sharpen your skill in studying the Bible, thinking biblically, or defending and fulfilling your piece of the Great Commission, you can simply go to thethink.institute/hammer and anvil today. Now, let's get into it. The doctrine of the virgin birth is a doctrine that is held dearly by Christians and often ridiculed by skeptics. If you want to learn how to explain and defend the truth of the virgin birth, this is the conversation for you. And that's because my guest today is the Reverend Dr. David Instone-Brewer. And I'm having him on because of this brilliant book, which I just recently read through. And in today's episode, you're going to find out how the insults that were leveled against Jesus point to the truth of the virgin birth. You'll also learn why the followers of Jesus simply would not have made this doctrine up. Reverend Dr. David Instone-Brewer, who is the author of Church Doctrine and the Bible, is a research fellow at Tyndale House, which is a research library in Cambridge, England. He himself is a former Baptist minister, and he's the author of multiple books, not just Church Doctrine and the Bible. And in this episode, you are going to hear Reverend Instone-Brewer unpack the biblical account of the Virgin Mary and the birth of Christ in a way that's going to help you see it in its ancient context, and is going to really help strengthen your theological and apologetic backbone. And so really, I'm absolutely thrilled to have him on the show. Without any further ado, please welcome the Reverend Dr. David Instone-Brewer to the Institute podcast. David, welcome.
Hi, it's great to be with you, Joel.
Well, it's my pleasure, believe me. And I'm so grateful for you taking the time out of your evening and joining us. And it's 2:00 p.m. in Chicago. What time is it there in England?
Oh, it's only about 8 p.m. So it's a nice night here.
Wonderful, wonderful. And maybe you could share us a little bit of your story, David. You've really got quite a fascinating story as to how you came from local church ministry and the work that you do now with Tyndale House. But maybe you could give us the brief synopsis of who you are and how you came to work at Tyndale House and what you do now.
Well, the more interesting story is before I became a minister, because that was a big drag of me through lots of different things, because I wanted to not be in the ministry and got a different idea. So I actually did 4 years of medicine before medicine and me decided we weren't going to go on together. And I've done lots of other jobs. My most interesting job was 6 months as a professional hacker. Hackers
Really?
are good people as well as bad people. Yeah. Lots of
Wow.
professions, microbiology technician, salesman, yeah, lots of different things. But
That's
then
really
I went into
fascinating.
ministry.
So my son, my oldest, wants to be a hacker. That's what he wants to do. So he's learning how to code, and you said you did that for 6 months?
Well, I was on a contract. This firm had the Turkey of the Year award for their terrible software, and the programmers had gone off with the code. So they needed someone to do what it says at the beginning of every bit of software terms and conditions. Do not reverse engineer this. And I had to do that in order to create the code for the program and then to hack it and to correct all the wrong bits without having the source code to work from.
Well, that's simply incredible. So how much of that work ties into what you now do with the Tyndale House?
Well, I'm very much into computational linguistics now, which is using the Bible, using computers to help me learn about the Bible and tie up the original languages with our translations. And I'm aiming to produce code which will automatically tag a foreign Bible to the Greek and Hebrew that underlies it.
Wow. That's really incredible. And I was doing a little bit of homework on you, and I found out that you developed a word processor that would type from right to left for essentially for Hebrew and Arabic. And that was before Microsoft or anybody else was on that. Is that correct?
That's right. Yes, most of the synagogues in the UK used my program to write their weekly newsletters, and universities used it for their Hebrew papers. Yeah, before Microsoft did.
Well, that's really amazing. I hope that Microsoft is paying you heavy royalties for for that.
I needed it to write up my thesis, which was had an awful lot of Hebrew in it.
Well, okay, so if you're listening to the show or watching it, you can see why I wanted to have David on the show. I mean, just it's not every day that someone just needs a word processor that can write from right to left and just invents it and just creates it. So you see the caliber of guest that he is, and the caliber of thinker, and that's really why I wanted to have him on to talk about this doctrine of the virgin birth, because I read this book. David, I read your book, Church Doctrine and the Bible, put out by Lexham, and it was put out this year. And I've got to say, one of the things I really appreciated about it is you seem to unpack these ideas in a way that is independent, at least of any denominational identification that I could identify based on my context here in the States. So, there were times when, you seemed, to, and toe the line is not the right word, but where it seemed like, what you were saying was in line with this denomination. And then something else you would say seemed in line with this other denomination over here. And it struck me as being very independent in its nature. Is that something you did intentionally, or is that just the kind of thinker that you are?
It's partly because of my ignorance. I know nothing about anything between about 200 AD and 2000 AD.
Okay.
But I live in the 1st and 2nd century, and that's the people I was writing for. The New Testament believers who suddenly got this new stuff about Jesus, and they don't know what to believe about it. And the New Testament is given to them, and I'm seeing the New Testament and the Old Testament to a great extent through their eyes, and seeing what would they do with it? How would they understand it? What's their terminology? How do they understand this word? And what was doctrine like in those days before the theologians got hold of it?
Okay, so that sort of return to the 1st century and BC cultural milieu and the original context is something that is really seeming to be experiencing a resurgence right now. You've got N.T. Wright, who's doing that. You've got Michael Heiser, who's doing that. I actually had Michael Heiser on the show. Dr. Heiser and I talked about demons. I've had Patrick Schreiner wrote this brilliant book on the resurrection. He's a scholar down at Midwestern Theological Seminary. And so I very much appreciate that. And I think our listeners are going to appreciate hearing about the virgin birth from sort of the original first century context. But for your own story, where did your interest in tackling theology in its original context and its cultural milieu, where did that come from?
Well, when I went to do research at Cambridge, I wanted to look at the way in which Paul interprets the Old Testament in comparison with the way in which the rabbis interpreted the Old Testament at the same time. And then I found that no one had actually worked on that. No one had actually isolated the rabbis of New Testament times and looked at how they used the Old Testament. So I ended up reading pretty well everything written by the rabbis that can be dated that early, and understanding them, and they became my friends. So now when I read the New Testament, I'm reading it through their eyes and seeing, well, what's it saying to them? How is Jesus talking to them? Is he insulting them? Is he debating with them? And what's the language he's using? They understood him better than we do because he was speaking to them. And it just transformed my understanding of the New Testament, to see it through their eyes.
And you studied them so much, you say that you felt like they became your friends.
Yeah.
I love that.
When you mix with enough rogues and you meet them and meet their wives and you see their children, you become friends with them, even if you don't quite like what they stand for.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. And you've written numerous books. Prominently, you've written about divorce and remarriage, which, your section in Church Doctrine and the Bible on divorce and remarriage was very helpful. It's something that I myself, I'm a former pastor myself, and that's one of those pastoral issues that every pastor is going to have to face. And I really appreciated your chapter, but having written so much on family issues and things like that, why this book, and why now?
Well, partly because I've got the freedom now. I've now taken early retirement, which means I still have all the facilities at Tyndale House and I still have a post there. They don't pay me, but also they don't tell me what to do. So I can spend all my time on the things I enjoy doing, which is at the moment stepbible.org, which is a great way of reading the Bible and using all the powers of your computer to do so for free. And also at biblecontexts.com. That's more than one context. Bible Contexts, where you'll find how many volumes? There's 6 books there, and 3 of them are already available and another 3 coming. Taking the context of the Bible and seeing the Bible next to the things at the time and also next to our time, and putting the Bible back into our lives and seeing how it fitted into their lives. And that's my excitement. So if I'm excited about it, I write about it.
Man, that's incredibly liberating to be able to do the kind of work and research that you are excited about. Man, praise God for that opportunity. As you were determining which doctrines would go into this book, Church Doctrine in the Bible, how did you choose which doctrines you would include, David, and why include the doctrine of the virgin birth?
Well, I chose the ones which we have problems with, or the ones which theologians, in my opinion, have changed over the years, where it's become quite complicated. Different theologians came up with different ideas, and I'm a kind of Baptist back to the Bible person, and I want to see everything as it is in the Bible and forget about all these later developments. And I found that people didn't see that in the same way, and that was interesting to them. So, hey, if it's interesting to them, I'll let them read it.
Yeah, certainly. So the big idea that I'd love for us to tackle today is the internal evidence, the scriptural evidence that the virgin birth really happened. And so in your section on the virgin birth, which is chapter 8, and it's not overly long, but it's packed with really good information. And there were 2 main arguments that you laid forth in terms of internal scriptural evidence for why the doctrine of the virgin birth is nothing we ought to be ashamed of. But before we unpack those 2 main arguments and any other arguments you want to bring to the table, could you just identify for us and explain what is the doctrine of the virgin birth and why is this contested?
Well, you had a very strange situation. You had a lady who wasn't married and very young, probably in our eyes, who was pregnant. And she said, and the man that decided to marry her, despite all the objections of his family, I'm sure, they both said, it's nothing to do with them. There's no hanky-panky. It was God who made her pregnant. And this is such an incredible story, such an unbelievable story, such a ridiculous story. And yet there it is. And it's in all four Gospels.
Right. And why is it so contested today? Why is this, this is one of those doctrines that still to this day is often ridiculed or at least greatly misunderstood.
Well, you say it's ridiculed today. It would have been ridiculed just as much in their day. It was a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, it's wrong on all sorts of grounds. The Jews, they didn't believe in miracles. They're a bit like the cessationist Christians. But miracles happened in the Old Testament. They didn't happen anymore. And there are just a couple of Jews that we know of that actually believed in real miracles at their time.
And that's right.
Yeah. Eric Eve wrote this wonderful PhD on miracles, which is published now as a good book. Eric Eve as in Adam and Eve.
Okay.
He points out that miracles in the first century were regarded as with great skepticism by Jews and especially by Romans, Greeks, because all the new religions that came up, they all claimed to be wonderful religions because of miracles, and people just laughed at it. And he tells some in Lucian, you find some hilarious stories about some of these miracles that started off new religions, and this was comic literature because people realized it was just all phooey. So when the church fathers tried to tell people about Jesus, they kept quiet about his miracles because they knew that wasn't going to convince anyone. And they talked about Jesus as a great teacher and a great moral example, but not as a miracle worker. That wasn't going to sell the gospel at all.
That's really fascinating, because weren't there purported miracles that one of the Caesars supposedly could do? If it was Augustus, I forget who it was, but one of the Caesars purportedly could heal people. Was that not a part of their worldview? Obviously, I don't believe that, but wasn't that part of the Greco-Roman worldview?
Yeah. There are all sorts of strange, fanciful stories told. They're recorded in Suetonius and in Tacitus, and you can tell from the way in which they're being reported that, hey, this is the propaganda. We've got to say it, but wink, wink.
Got it.
People were. They regarded intelligent people as people who didn't believe this sort of thing. They were skeptical. It's the people on the streets, you've got to keep them happy. Caesar is divine, so obviously he has to do miracles, but, we're sophisticated. Right.
So it's almost as if these reports from Tacitus or whoever, it's almost like they had their little fact check label underneath the post. Okay, yes, Caesar did so and so. This miracle happened, but these claims have been disputed by reputable historical investigators. So this,
they just had a chuckle.
Well, that's really fascinating. I think a lot of people will be surprised to know that the first century worldview was not one that really allowed for miracles. Because I think oftentimes in my interactions, David, with skeptics, atheists, they sort of lump anybody who lived during the biblical era, whether Old Testament or New Testament, in with these, they'll call them, first century goat herders or cave dwellers who believed in all sorts, miracles were happening all the time. And you're saying that wasn't the case.
No, there was one rabbi, Rabbi Honi, who said, oh, yeah, I can bring rain down from heaven. And he prayed for rain and vindicated himself by that rain coming. But they almost excommunicated him for it. They really didn't like that sort of thing.
Wow. Well, that's really incredible to hear, and makes it creates an even starker contrast in terms of the background in which the virgin birth happened. So in your book, you mentioned two really solid reasons to believe in the virgin birth. despite its sort of outrageous nature. The first one has to do with the insults that Jesus received throughout his life, and the other one has to do with more common sense. Could you tell us about that first reason, and then we'll move on to the second one?
Yeah, I said that all four Gospels refer to the virgin birth. Because the virgin birth was a problem, one way in which I learned as a salesman, one of my careers which didn't do so well was selling stuff. And I was always taught, if there's a weakness in the product, then address that weakness straight away. You know, if the car goes slowly, you say it's sedate. If the house is small, you say it's compact. And so that Luke and Matthew, they bring to the front the virgin birth. They say, yes, Mary was very special and Jesus was very special because of the virgin birth. Because people have heard of it and they got to do something with it. So Matthew says the virgin birth made Jesus more part of the establishment, you know, and Herod was interested and it made him the kingly line exactly correct. And Luke says, well, it made him more part of the ordinary person because Luke is the great social reformer. You know, the poor people are important. And so, you know, Mary was amongst the poor people and the shepherds, and they make a virtue of it. But Mark, he doesn't mention it, except when Jesus goes to preach in Nazareth, they say, well, who is this guy? He's the son of a carpenter. Well, actually, he's the son of Mary. And they never mention Joseph's name. They call Jesus Ben Mary. Now,
Right.
Jewish names, they always got the father as a surname. So I would be David Ben Noel, because my father was called Noel. And the Jews are always called after their fathers. There's a few cases where you don't. If your name is Simon, Simon was so common, they named you after the place or your particular enthusiasm. So Simon the Zealot, Simon from Galilee, Simon Peter, Simon the Rock. If your name was Simon, you didn't have a patronym. You weren't named after your father. But everyone else, we've got hundreds of rabbis and other people named in Jewish literature, and none of them are named after their mother, like Jesus was. And that was an insult. That was throwing the piss pot in your face to say Jesus Ben Mary.
Wow.
And in John, it's even worse. In John 8, you've got a heckler as Jesus is giving this wonderful address about how he's the son of the Father and how the Father loves people and he's sent Jesus to come and save them. There's this heckler who's saying, hey, hang on a minute, you're no one to talk. He says in verse 19, he says, where's your father? People in the crowd, they're going, what's he talking about? Well, haven't you heard? You know, haven't you heard about him? He doesn't have a father. And then he says, and what's your name? Who are you? Hoping that he'll say Jesus, son of Joseph, which is his proper title, but he didn't let on like that. And then he says, this heckler says again in verse 33, he says, we're sons of Abraham, we're good Jews, you know. And then the heckler finishes off in verse 41 with the killer line. He says, at least we're not illegitimate.
Right.
Yeah, all four Gospels have to deal with this, and it's a big, big issue.
So now this ridicule then, okay, so Jesus was maligned, Jesus was insulted, but David, you say that this points toward the truth of the virgin birth. Why is this not just evidence that Jesus was illegitimately born?
Well, remember, it's not just the Gospels who are saying this sort of thing. You have the same sort of thing in rabbinic works. Jesus being called the son of Pandera, and then you have to. By the 3rd century, they're not quite sure who this Pandera is, and they're asking each other what perhaps it means. So it goes back quite some time. Probably goes back to Eliezer ben Hyrcanus from the end of the 1st century. They're saying that Jesus was born from a Roman soldier. You know, it was a rape or Mary just misbehaving. And it's everyone. Everyone is saying this. And it's something that the church has to grapple with and do something with. And the church isn't denying it. The gospel writers don't deny it. And so you have to think, why don't they try and cover it up? And the question I asked myself was, mainly I'm an ancient historian. My whiting hair is making that title more and more apt.
Putting the ancient in ancient historian.
That's it. Yeah. But as a historian, you have to say to yourself, how would a human being react in this situation? What would they do? And the question I ask is, what lie would I tell if I was Joseph? What's the best story to get away with? What's the best story? And the idea of saying a virgin birth is just so difficult. You end up being called a blasphemer by the Jews, or even worse, you're told, oh well, that's like those Roman gods, they had virgin births, so you're going to be telling one of those pagan stories. The worst thing you can call a Jew is a non-Jew.
Right.
And it's just so difficult to get away with. And as I said, it's just unbelievable. So the other lie he could tell is to say, hey, Mary was raped, and I'm really sad about that, and I'm standing up for her, and I'm marrying her. Have some sympathy for me. And I think that would work. These things happened, especially with the Roman soldiers around.
Sure.
You said it's an adulterous generation. The Roman occupation brought terrible moral degradation to Palestine with prostitution and things.
Yeah. And so, and Jesus even, refers to that sort of thing. He says, if someone forces you to walk a mile, walk the extra mile. You were in a context where the Roman soldiers could force you to walk a mile with them. The Jewish people's rights were degraded. They were denied. They were under a form of occupation and a form of tyranny. And so this idea that Mary could have been raped by a Roman soldier, that really was not beyond the pale. That was actually very realistic.
Yeah.
And so this reality that we see in Scripture, that Jesus was not Joseph's son, is really the setup then for the second argument, which is really nobody would have made this doctrine up. Is that right?
Let me tell you the lie that I would have told.
Okay.
If I was Joseph, I would have said, well, there's a little bit of, we sort of got to bed together one night, and one thing led to another, and you know how it is, and what can you do? She's so beautiful, and so she's pregnant. And they would have been embarrassed by that. They would have got a slap on the wrist for that, but virtually nothing else. To have a child before you're actually married didn't mean that you had a bastard. If you had a child for someone you're not married to at all, that's a bastard. And that was really serious, because then they couldn't take part in any synagogue things. They couldn't go into a temple. They couldn't do religious things that needed cleanliness for 10 generations.
Wow.
Yeah, they took it seriously. But if it was just some hanky-panky before you actually got married, well, you're still a valid Jew, and that you weren't called a mamzer, a bastard. And Jesus wasn't called a mamzer. But yeah, I would have told that lie. I would have said, hey, we got over enthusiastic, and lo and behold, Jesus came along, and there wouldn't have been any problem. And he would have been welcomed home. The town would have been, but hey, we love them. But no, they didn't even tell that lie.
So there, you've got Mary and Joseph and Jesus, not to mention his brothers and sisters, as well as their extended family, willingly taking on ridicule, scorn, questions, snarky whispering behind their backs, willingly taking this on. That if the virgin birth weren't true, they would have no reason. Basically, any explanation is better than coming up with this, especially when you factor in. Now, this is something that's really amazing to me. At one point, you've got Jesus preaching in a house, and Jesus's mother and brothers come to him, and essentially they think he's crazy, and they're going to collect Jesus and bring him back home. So the attitude that you see from Jesus's family is not, oh, here's the God man who is the Messiah, he's the savior of the world, and therefore we need to concoct this half man, half God story where it's like one of those ancient pagan stories of the gods coming down. No, they're not trying to come up with this miraculous story. If anything, they would really like it if Jesus would just sort of be quiet and would kind of keep it down. They're not trying to come up with this grand pagan myth for him. So there's no reason, it seems like, to create this virgin birth narrative like the Egyptians had, like the Romans had, if it weren't something that was just actually true. And these are just honest people sort of just reporting what honestly took place. Is that right?
Yeah, and they're not saying it's a virgin birth. They're saying, well, this happened. Oh, I don't know what it is, but that's what happened.
Right.
They're telling the truth to great, which is causing them great problems. I don't think his brothers and sisters would have gone along with it. We don't get any indication that they were followers. Later, of course, then you have James and Jude. But I think before the resurrection, there just wasn't anything. You don't get any indication he's getting any help from his family. And you have Mary sort of following along and being a comfort and being, but hey, it's my son up there after all. But support from the family, no. It was just such a big problem. It's the biggest thing is Jesus is going round unmarried. You don't think much about that, but the very first commandment that any Jew had to obey was the first commandment that's written in Scripture, and that says, "Go forth and multiply." And it was the duty of every single Jewish man to find a wife and have children. It was such a strict thing that the rabbis even debated, how many children do we have to have before we can give up this sex thing?
Right. So how does the fact that Jesus was unmarried factor in with the broader discussion of his parentage and the virgin birth?
Who's going to marry him? How could he get married if he was he wasn't a mamzer, he wasn't a bastard, because in order to be officially a mamzer, you had to have two people as witnesses of the act of conception.
Really?
Which
that seems a little
very often.
Yeah, right. Good grief. Yeah, that seems like a tough bar to clear. So this is all. I'm sorry. Go ahead, David. You were going to say something.
So who's going to marry him? No doubt Mary and Joseph wanted him to get married, but anyone they approach would say, "Well, I don't want my daughter to marry him. I've heard about him. He's not kosher. He's not. He's not actually a mamzer. He's not actually a bastard. But he's not official either, is he? You say that he's not yours, so he must be someone else's."
Wow. So they're creating complications.
Yeah, he's ours. We did it a little bit too soon. They would say, "Oh, fine. Look, come and meet my daughter. She loves him."
Okay, so they're creating unnecessary quote unquote complications by sticking with this story, and they're sticking with it because it's the best explanation based on the evidence here is that it's simply true.
Well, they're going to have to stick with it, especially when Jesus gets to the age of 20. Now, the rules of the rabbis, they were quite strict. If a person isn't married by the time he's 20, because usually they got married in their teens, and if he's sticking out and not getting married even in his 20s, then you don't let him sleep next to another man. You don't let him teach children on his own. And you don't let him look after animals on his own. And you can fill in the reasons for that.
Sure. Well, that's really fascinating. So it reinforces for me this incredible, Jesus is Lord and I love him, but just the respect I have for him as a man, how he just did not fear men. He did not fear the ridicule or the disapproval of men. And you really see that from his birth straight on through to his death and resurrection. This is not a man who cared about what people thought of him in the sense of their disapproval of him.
I wouldn't say that he didn't care. He was human. It would have hurt.
Hmm.
He was despised. He was rejected. And
Okay,
that
so
must
that's,
hurt.
but okay, fair enough. But it didn't affect him in the sense that he changed his behavior the way that you and I might, or, you know, speaking for myself, wanting people to like me or approve of me, is gonna, you know, it's gonna impact the way that the things that I say or the way that I act. Whereas Jesus really, he was on mission. He knew what he had come to do. And, you know, you bring up a good point. Sure, no one likes to be despised and rejected, but Jesus didn't change his story because of that.
No, he even had to create some theology to make room for himself. There were two reasons why you could be a eunuch. You could be a eunuch because something happened at birth, or you can be a eunuch because of an accident that happens afterwards. And Jesus had those two forms of eunuch. He's listed those two and said, or you can be a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven, that you can, in other words, not get married and serve God nevertheless, even though you've done that sort of sin of not obeying the first commandment, you can nevertheless serve God in his kingdom and be a eunuch for the kingdom. He had to invent that category to fit himself in.
Well, that's really amazing. I never thought about that. And of course, that still has implications, pastoral implications today for marriage and singleness. So, David, we had a question come in, and then I had a few other questions from folks on Facebook. And if it's all right with you, I'd like to go ahead and transition to answering a few of those questions.
Sure.
Okay, so the first one to come in here, this is from Chris Johnson, who's watching on YouTube. And he asks this: would the Jews have expected a virgin birth given Isaiah 7:14?
No, it's one of the prophecies which you can understand in retrospect, but planning ahead, you just wouldn't predict it. It's like Psalm 22. You look at it, it's talking about all these animals, you know, the bulls of Bashan and the dogs and the lions, and it looks like Jesus is dying in a circus, in one of the Roman circuses. If you were going to predict what Psalm 22 was about and you knew it was about Jesus, you'd say he died in a Roman circus. But then when it happens on the cross and it's the dry tongue and the bones sticking out, and it's obviously crucifixion. And these are just metaphorical animals. But you don't know what's metaphorical. You don't know what's literal in a prophecy. And when you see the prophecy of a young girl, yes, unlikely to be a virgin because she's not married, an Alma, but there's no emphasis on her being a virgin and actually having a child, and then before that child is 2 or 3 years old, then this other thing will happen. No one would have found a prediction of the virgin birth there. But after it's happened, then you go, whoa, hang on, that passage was a bit strange, wasn't it? Whoa, I can see what God was on about.
Well, sure. And, you know, coupled with that is Isaiah 14 is also fulfilled in the immediate context with the conception and birth of Hezekiah.
Sure.
And so it's not until Jesus is born, until the Gospels are written, where, you know, people could look back and go, oh, it wasn't just about Hezekiah. It wasn't just about a woman who happened to be a virgin when it was written, who then gave birth to Hezekiah. There's a double fulfillment here. Speaking, of course, about Mary. And so you're saying that there would not have been, based on that passage, there would not have been that expectation.
Well, there's the possibility, because the Greek translators, perhaps about 200 BC, translated that Alma into Parthenos. So it's a virgin who conceives, and that is rather strange. Right. Using that language. So some people might have looked at language and thought maybe something strange is going to happen, but that really is a long shot. And most Jews, they reckon that the church has changed the Septuagint to say Parthenos. It didn't really say that, because the Hebrew doesn't imply virgin. The Hebrew uses the word for someone who would be expected to be a virgin, but doesn't say categorically it's a virgin.
Yeah, and that brings up, without going down this rabbit trail, it does bring up the matter of how involved the Holy Spirit was, not just in the original writing of Isaiah, but also in the process of it, that Hebrew being translated over into the Greek for the Septuagint. I'm not putting my flag on the ground saying that the Septuagint is inspired, but it is fascinating that they did use Parthenos.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember the ending, but yeah.
Okay. Yes. The word that specifically meant virgin.
Mhm.
So Chris Johnson does say thank you for that answer.
Yeah, but we don't have the manuscripts from back then, so we can't be sure that the church didn't change that word to Parthenos. It might have happened. It's impossible to tell. We don't have a copy of Greek Isaiah from that time.
Okay, fair enough. So Nate Warner, who's watching on YouTube, he says this: if the Jews didn't expect Jesus to be born of a virgin, well, and I guess we could say didn't expect the Christ or the Messiah to be born of a virgin, does that help to explain why so many weren't looking, especially since they were under Roman captivity and looking for a political leader? What are your thoughts?
Well, Jesus wasn't like the Messiah they were expecting in so many different ways. I think the fact of his questionable birth is a very minor one. No one's going to prove anything from that. Jesus wasn't leading any political movement. He wasn't even being a great speaker. You know, he was talking to ordinary people, talking to the crowds, not talking in the temple, not talking to to the high and mighty, not talking in the great academic schools. He must have looked like a village rabbi who'd got above himself. He just didn't look like a Messiah. And then when he was killed by crucifixion, well, that's it. There's just no way he can be a Messiah, because that's like saying that someone on death row is the leader of a new religion. It just makes him completely worthless.
Well, sure. Cursed is anyone who's hung on a tree.
Yeah, there's a nice scripture to show how bad he is, but you really don't get it if you're thinking that that's why it didn't like people who were crucified. People were crucified naked, and it was such a shameful death. And there's no way that you can endure that pain without defecating while you're on the cross. It was a horrible place. As Luther said, that Jesus was born amongst the buzzing flies and died among the buzzing flies. He really went through terrible, terrible things for us. And there's no way the Jew could look at that idea of someone on the cross and say, oh, yeah, that's my God. And so Christians didn't use the cross symbol for 3 centuries. The only image we have of a cross in the first couple of centuries is by someone who's making fun of a Christian and puts a man with an ass's head on a cross and says, Alex Animos, worshipping his God.
Right.
The cross was such a terrible. But we're not talking about the cross. That's just another bit of the gospel that you can't ignore, because it's not what you'd invent. It's just not. It wouldn't work if you wanted to make it up.
Yeah, it really is incredible how counterintuitive the gospel is. How it contravened their expectations then, and it goes against our expectations today. The verse that says it is foolishness to those who disbelieve is still just as true now as it was in the first century.
Yeah, but now the cross is cleaned up. You know, we wear it on our necks, and we put it on our churches. Yeah. We wouldn't put a gallows with a rope hanging down on the front of our churches.
No, right. But then again, Jesus didn't die on a gallows either.
No. But the point is that's the sort of image that people see. Right. You know, we've cleaned up the cross, and we've cleaned up the virgin birth, and we've cleaned up the arguments that he had with other rabbis. We see a sanctified Jesus. He's easier to sell now than he was in the first century. And
sure. Well, which is why it's so helpful to do what you did in your book, which is to go back and look at the doctrine through first century eyes, because the virgin birth is not a clean doctrine. It's not it's not a porcelain figurine sitting delicately on a mantle. This is something that would have been scandalous, and it would have been very controversial, and it would have been a barrier to faith for many.
Yeah. And his very humble birth, we talk about a humble birth, it was filthy. When I was in medicine, I had to give birth to 12 children. I mean, help at the birth of 12
Congratulations.
children.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah. And it's a messy affair. And even when you got all the cleanness of a hospital, right. But with animals there and animals urinating on the straw that you've just cleaned, I can't. The idea that he was going to be king is just laughable. These stories are not made up. They're stories which they're reported because someone's going to whisper it if you don't say it.
So you put it up front. You do what Matthew and Luke did. You put it up front and you say, look, we know you're going to have a problem with this. Here, it really did happen, but here's the significance of it.
Yeah, that's it.
Even the fact that Jesus was born in, or that he grew up in Nazareth would have been a blight on his reputation. And so Matthew grounds it. He goes, look, it was written he would be called a Nazarene, which, even there he has to find that, he has to do some creative wordplay there. But Jesus, he had an ignominious upbringing, and that goes back to his birth.
He had a hard job. And the only way you can explain that Christianity took off and took over the world is by the Holy Spirit working through those people who had to speak these impossible things and tell these impossible stories and explain that God loved us that much to come down into that filth and join us. So,
David, I did get a question this is on Facebook earlier today. David Weber asked this. He says, and I'll put this up on the screen in just a moment so you can see it, but he says, I would be interested in a Christian response to leftist smears that the virgin birth is somehow tantamount to rape. How would you respond to that?
Well, rape is when a woman doesn't consent. And we know jolly well that Mary did consent in such a beautiful and humble way. May I be your servant. And she was told that God was going to give her this child, and she said yes. She didn't say no.
Yeah. So she obviously agreed, and we still honor her to this day for that. What do you make of the fact that the conception was not sexual? It was not standard biological intercourse. Does that factor in as well?
We've no idea what happened. And presumably something just miraculous happened in her womb. An ovum drops down and starts dividing, but it can't just be parthenogenesis because then you get a girl. Something very strange happens there. We've no idea.
Right.
And how it happened,
Yeah, no, that's fair. The scripture does not give us the
camera moves away from the fireplace at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's right. That's good. But we do know that he was born to a virgin. He was conceived from a virgin. So whatever the method was that God used, which as shrouded in mystery as it wasn't it couldn't have been what we consider a sexual reproduction. Would you agree with that or no?
Sure. I mean, if it wasn't a human, then it wasn't sexual reproduction. But what it was, no idea. No idea.
Okay, fair. Let's see. This is tangentially related, so feel free, David, to pass on this one. But I would actually like to know your thoughts on this. This is a question coming from someone named Shane O'Neill. Here's what he says. Now, I posted on Facebook earlier. I said, what question should I ask David Instone-Brewer? And I'll read the question verbatim, and then I'll give my interpretation of it. He says, is it related to the two genealogies found in the Gospels, that Mary, a descendant of Jeconiah, doesn't allow him a descendant on the throne by virtue of the the virgin birth. So here you do have, was it Jeconiah? My understanding is that, okay, so let's back up here. So there was a descendant of David who sat on the throne, who was told by Yahweh that he would not have a descendant on the throne forever. The difficulty comes in that here you've got Jesus, a descendant of David, but because he's not blood related to Joseph, he's not a blood descendant of this king who Jesus told would never have a descendant on the throne. Have you interacted with this concept before? And I'd love to know your thoughts on it. I'm very curious about it. And I'd also like to know what you make of the two different genealogies of Jesus. Is one of them Mary's and the other one Joseph? How do you unpack all this? And I forgive the ambiguity of the questioning, but maybe you can make some sense out of that.
Yeah, well, those two genealogies are fascinating. It's not just that they diverge at one point. It's that they're bits missing to make the nice pattern of the 14s and things. And the two genealogies are important in that they tell you it fixes Jesus as a Jew, fixes Jesus in the royal line, and then this wonderful thing that that he's not supposed to be descended from this bit of king, but he is allowed to be descended like back down this line. Maybe, it tells such a wonderful story. I love it. It should be true because it's nice. Whether it actually works or not, I don't know. So you have to have one genealogy going through Mary, one genealogy going through Joseph, which fixes that contradiction. And hey, we don't know enough to know whether that's right, but it works. So let's go with it. But the thing we have to remember is that every single one of those ancestors of Jesus was a sinner. And every one of those ancestors inherited the propensity to sin as soon as they could do anything. As soon as they were a toddler, asked to do something, they say, no, like all toddlers do.
Right. Nobody has to teach them to do that.
And when Jesus is born, you just can't find any sin in his life at all. He's inherited all this from all those generations of sinners, and he doesn't sin. Not because he doesn't have that propensity to sin. He has all the same temptations that we have, and yet he doesn't. And that's what makes him God to me, that he can live as a real human and yet leave that part of humanity completely to one side.
Yeah. Now this, again, this would be a rabbit trail, man. We unfortunately we don't have time, but maybe on a future recording, this would be something where as I was reading your book, this was one of those areas where I wasn't sure if I disagreed with you or not. And that's in your handling of the original Sin Doctrine. And you make a distinction between original sin and original sinfulness. and I thought that was really fascinating. And man, I'm peering over the chasm here, and I'm about to,
it's got to be for another time.
It's got to be. Okay, but I did think that was fascinating the way you handle that. So anyone listening, anyone watching, please go pick up Church Doctrine in the Bible by David Instone-Brewer. Read it for yourself, and if nothing else, it's very stimulating.
Go to BibleContexts.com because every week you've got a new chapter for free. There's 3 chapters there all the time, or 3 or 4 chapters all the time for free. And every week it's a new one. And so you get to read the whole book for free. You just have to read it bit by bit.
Well, that's incredible. So definitely go check out BibleContexts.com. And, we had a couple of other questions come in, but I think that they were the questions were pretty much subsumed under what we've spoken about before. But David, I have to just thank you profusely for taking time out of your evening. And for folks who would like to follow your work, there's BibleContext.com, which I think is wonderful. They can go and get chapters uploaded to that website. They can read them for free. That's fantastic. What's next for you, and how else can people follow your work?
Well, the other things I'm working on mostly is stepbible.com or stepbible.org. Which is a way in which you can read multiple Bibles next to each other and easily get through to the Greek and Hebrew without knowing any Greek and Hebrew. And it's just the perfect way of reading your Bible. You can read an easy peasy translation next to one of these horrible, difficult things which follow the Greek and Hebrew, and you can hover over words and see what the what the original was, and click on it and then search the whole Bible for a word in Hebrew, but see the results in English or Madagascan or whatever your language is. But, yeah, it's a wonderful tool. I use it all the time, even though I've got Accordance and the Old Bible Works and Logos on my computer. I use Step Bible because it's much faster.
Oh, this is really amazing. I've got it up. If you're watching live, I've got it up on the screen. You can scroll over a word here and you can see it in the original Hebrew. You can see how many times it occurs in the Bible. You can click on the word to see more information. This is really amazing. And this is free. I didn't have to sign up for anything or pay anything to get this. This is just a free resource.
Yep, it's specifically designed for disadvantaged world. You're getting it because they get it.
Amazing. Wow. Well, thank you for creating this. This is really amazing. I'm going to have some fun with this. I'm going to explore this. Now,
and don't forget to use the NIV with it as well. Drop down and get the NIV. I'm a bit biased there because I'm on the committee.
Oh, you're on the committee of the NIV. Okay. Well, there you have it. All right. Well, David, thank you again so much for joining us, and all God's blessings to you and in your continued work. Thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you again for joining me. And you know what, really quickly, if someone has a follow-up question based on something that you've said, or they want to know where they can get an incredible Santa hat like the one you're wearing that says "Bah Humbug," is there? Would you care to share a way that someone could get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think I'll be watching the Facebook feed from this podcast, and so I think that's probably the best place to do it.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, there you have it. David Instone-Brewer, thank you again for joining us. And let me just a couple of housekeeping notes for the Think Institute. If you enjoyed this, if you learned something, please like this video on Facebook or YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you have any inquiries for me, you can send them to thethink.institute@gmail.com. And then as well, my family and I are support raising missionaries with an organization called Cru. And so if you'd like to partner with us, you can do that by going to give.cru.org/1018841. That's our giving page. If you haven't done so yet, go and check out our website, thethink.institute. While you're there, you can search the back catalog of all of our podcast episodes and other interviews that we've had with scholars, thinkers, pastors, creators, and culture builders. So check that out. Thank you for watching. I certainly hope that you heard something that was helpful to you. I know I certainly did. And remember, this is not goodbye. This has just been a little pit stop along the way of your spiritual journey. And that's about all we have for you today. So until next time,